Books are the greatest source of knowledge, and I'm very excited to be a part of the Jaipur Literature Festival, which is the largest free literature festival in the world, inviting millions of book lovers. So guys, today I'm going to be attending the book launch of the Cartiers along with Francesca, and here I share the untold story of the jewelry empire.
My name is synonymous with outstanding craftsmanship, creativity, and a long history with numerous royal families, including mine.
So the three Cartier brothers, over the third generation of Cartiers, it was really them that started making their own jewellery. Up until then, Cartier hadn't produced unique pieces, it had bought them in from outside workshops and sold them elsewhere. But the three brothers had this rule: never copy, only create. And the idea was that inspiration could and should be taken from everywhere, except from existing jewellery. So Louis Cartier, the oldest brother, he didn't hire jewellery designers. He hired architects or interior designers or experts in lace. He wanted to bring something else to the jewellery trade. And the result is pieces like, hopefully this will work. So this tiara, which was kind of inspired by 18th century architecture, and was very different to what other jewellers were doing at the time when the fashion was for Art Nouveau. Cartier were creating pieces like this. But he also was very creative in terms of the materials he used. So at the time, platinum wasn't used in jewellery, it was an industrial metal. But Louis Cartier had spotted it underneath a railway carriage. He spotted this really bright, shiny metal that seemed to be strong and thin and light and flexible, and he started with experimenting with it in jewellery. And the result was he was able to create pieces that looked so much lighter than so many of the pieces made in gold or silver of the time. For example, this piece here, made in 1912, where the diamonds almost seem to float in air. You can't see the mount at all, because he was being able to use his platinum. He also came up with the first wristwatch for men. So at the time, men wore pocket watches, and wristwatches were the preserve of women, often with a diamond or silk strap. So Louis Cartier created the first wristwatch for a male aviator friend, a pilot, who complained to Louis that he wasn't able to check his time when he was flying because he couldn't take his hands off his controls and look at his pocket watch. So Louis came up with the idea of strapping the watch to his wrist. But later on, he came up with a design for the tank watch, which remains very popular today. And that was very clever, because by basing the idea of this watch on a tank, which was a very masculine image, the idea of a tank in a war, he started to change the perception of a watch. He also called the watch le tank. He gave it a masculine pronoun in French, whereas the word for watch normally in French is feminine, la montre. So he slowly tried to change the idea behind a watch to make it less feminine and more masculine. And of course, it worked.
That's so interesting, because one of the challenges which he must have faced is, how do you convince people that something which is at the bottom of a railway line is good enough and expensive enough thing to set diamonds in? Or how do you convince men to wear a wristwatch? It's sort of, how did he do that? How did he do that? How did he sort of know how to change tastes in the way that he did?
Yeah, he had this amazing aesthetic sense, and he just knew what looked right and looked good. And his school, I went, as part of my research, I went to the brothers' old school, and I saw their school reports. And Louis, who ended up being this creative genius, his reports were awful. He got more black marks than anyone in the class, and his teachers said, he's useless, he doesn't follow the rules. But that was the whole point. He didn't follow the rules. He did things in his own way, and that's what made Cartier stand out from the competition.
Yeah. No, but at the center of the book is the relationship between these three brothers who turned this company into this massive international success. Do you want to tell us a little bit about them and the relationships between them? Because for many of us here in India, it's always interesting to see how a family firm works and all of the tugs and pulls and pushes between people who are working together, and of course they're also related to each other.
Yes, absolutely, it's true. So there were three brothers, and they were incredibly close. They'd grown up above their father's small jewellery workshop in Paris.
And you want to tell us their names?
Yeah, so Louis the eldest, he's in the middle. Pierre, the middle brother, he's on the left. And Jacques, the youngest, who's my great-grandfather, is on the right. So as small boys, they hadn't grown up particularly wealthy. Their father's jewellery business was relatively successful as a small Parisian business, but certainly weren't dressing kings and queens at that stage. So they'd grown up with a real ambition to create the leading jewellery firm in the world, and it's an ambition that's repeated in their letters again and again. And to do this, my grandfather told me the story that when they were boys, they came up with this plan. They took a map of the world and a pencil, and they basically split the world between them. And Louis, the elder brother, he said he would have Paris. Paris at that stage was the centre of the cultural world, the early 20th century. So he said he'd take Paris. Pierre, the middle brother, said he would take the Americas. There was an increasing amount of money coming in from America. And that left Jacques, my great-grandfather. I don't think he had much say in the matter. He was the youngest. He was given England and London, and with that went the British colonies. So it was Jacques who would travel a lot to India. So these three brothers had this kind of divide and conquer. They would split the world between them. So they were each in a different place, which was crucial to their success. But also, they each had different talents. I've spoken a bit about Louis' creative genius. Pierre, the middle brother, was a brilliant businessman. He's the one who managed to sell a pearl necklace in exchange for a building in New York. And that building on Fifth Avenue is still Cartier's headquarters today.
Tell us a little more about that story. It's a fascinating story.
It's a great story. So at that stage, Cartier had a very small showroom in New York, up on the second floor, nothing particularly spectacular. But it did have an incredible pearl necklace in the showroom, and the necklace was valued at $1 million. And this young bride, I think she was 16 when she married her much older businessman husband. So this young bride saw the necklace and she decided that she wanted it. She was called Maisie Plant, and the story goes that what Maisie wanted, Maisie got. And her husband had a townhouse, also valued at $1 million on Fifth Avenue. And he and Pierre Cartier had a little chat, and they decided to do a swap. The necklace for the building. So Cartier got the keys, Maisie got her necklace. Cartier totally transformed the building, and I've got this great letter from Pierre back to Jacques, who said, finally we can start French luxury in New York. And they were so excited. And they opened the store, and it was probably the best business move of the century, because in the 1950s, when, like 30 years later, when Maisie Plant died and her necklace was sold, it was sold for only $150,000. Because by then cultured pearls had exploded onto the market, so the value of natural pearls had totally plummeted. So yeah.
Wow. And where is the necklace now?
It's sold. I think it's split up like so many of them. Yeah.
Now, Cartier jewels are some of the most iconic pieces of art heritage in the world. Each one has a legend attached to it. There's the Hope diamond, there's the Romanov emeralds, there's the Panther pieces. Would you tell the audience a little bit about the story of each of these pieces? Because each piece it's like a book in its own right.
Yes, it's true. It can be many books. Let me move this one. So this is the cursed Hope diamond. So when Pierre Cartier was starting a store in New York, his philosophy was that they should only sell big, important gemstones, because the brothers had a rule they should never advertise. They were trying to attract royalty. If they advertised in magazines and newspapers, it wasn't the right image for them. So the best form of advertising was word of mouth. So the way to get mentioned on dinner party circuits was to sell really big, important jewels. So the Cartiers had bought this cursed diamond, and they bought it with this client in mind, this Evelyn Walsh McLean, very wealthy American heiress. The first time she was showed the cursed diamond by Pierre, she quite liked it, but in the end she decided it wasn't for her. So Pierre then had it reset in a new setting and showed it to her again. And she was a bit more keen this time, but still not totally convinced. So Pierre, he was a brilliant salesman, he said he knew instinctively what to do with each client, and he knew that Miss McLean was used to getting things and not giving them back. So he said to her, why don't you just take it home for a night, see how you feel and let me know in the morning. And she wrote in her memoirs that stone stared at me through the night, and by morning I knew I had to have the thing. So it worked. So she went to him and said that she did want it. But then in the end she had the stone, but 3 months later she hadn't paid still. The Cartier brothers had to start this big legal case against her. And then in the end she agreed that she would have to pay, but by now she was a bit worried about the curse. So she took it to a church to be blessed, and she had it placed on a red velvet cushion whilst the priest blessed this diamond. And she said at that point thunder and lightning shook the church, and where I think most people would take that as a sign to step away, I would, she thought that was a sign that all would be well, and she took the stone, and she had it her whole life. She did have a fair amount of bad luck come her way. Her husband left her, 2 of her children died young. But the stone is now in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, where it's valued at $350 million.
Wow. And the fourth diamond has an India connection, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, initially it was meant to have been potentially taken.
Do you want to tell the audience the story of the connection of the Hope Diamond with India, and also what was the curse?
What was the curse? Well, yes, it was meant to have been taken from the eye of an Indian god initially, and that's why it was said to have been cursed. And then previous owners have had awful fates, like being torn apart by wild dogs, or an actress wearing it had been shot on stage, and it was in the French crown jewels, and obviously Marie Antoinette got beheaded. That wasn't great. So yeah, there was a series of negative things. My grandfather told me when he found out that it had been in his family, he was terrified that there'd be a curse associated with it. So he wrote to his father from boarding school saying, is it true? Is there a curse? All the boys at boarding school are teasing me, saying my family is cursed. And his father wrote back and said, don't believe what you read in the magazines. It's a good way to sell a magazine or to sell a jewel, but not real.
And tell us about the Romanov emeralds. I think you've got a little bit about those.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what.
That's the panther.
Well, panther first. So, obviously the panther became associated with Cartier. It was really the Duchess of Windsor, I think, who was the first to really pick up on the panther in a big way, because she was quite a strong, formidable woman, and I think liked the image of this panther. But my grandfather told me another story, because his favourite book as a child was The Jungle Book, and his father used to always read him The Jungle Book at night. And he showed me his original Jungle Book, and in it his father had marked in the margin, and he'd circled a picture of Bagheera the panther chasing another animal, and he'd done a little note to make it into a jewel. So that you can see how the inspiration is coming, even from a father reading his son a bedtime story.
Wow. Yeah. And do we have anything on the famous emeralds, or?
Yeah.
Oh, but this is interesting, because one of the things we were talking about backstage when we were chatting was that each of these pieces has its own history, and they're fascinating pieces in their own right, but just as interesting as the pieces of jewelry themselves are the clients who bought these pieces, because they were some of the richest, most enigmatic, most powerful people in some cases in the history of the world. And just as each piece tells a story, the owner of each piece also tells a story, not just about Cartier, but also it's in a way the history of the world. So do you want to tell us a little bit about who these people are and these pieces of jewelry?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's what always interested me. It's not so much the jewels itself, but the stories behind them. And that story, you know, because jewels are such emotive things, you don't tend to give a jewel on a whim. You give it sort of an act of love or a way of saying sorry, or someone's died and it's been passed down. So but I found that was why writing this book was so interesting. I got into so many different human stories. But also it became, in a way, the story of the world, because following the jewels is like following the money and following the power around the world. So when Cartier started, it wasn't huge initially, and so the early clients were actually the courtesans rather than the queens. We've got a courtesan there, La Barucci on the left. And then later on it would be the Russians, the Romanovs, you know. So on the second from the left, we've got Grand Duchess Vladimir, and she's wearing the Romanov emeralds on her headdress. She received them as a gift on her wedding. Later, of course, she would, or the Russians would smuggle their jewels out of Russia during the Russian Revolution. So whereas Russia had been the best country for Cartier in terms of clients, then Cartiers ended up buying all the jewels back from the Russians that they had sold their jewels to, and remounting them and selling them to other clients, which they did with the Romanov emeralds. So just jumping a bit, but on the far right is Barbara Hutton, American heiress, wearing those same Romanov emeralds in the 1960s.
So those are the same emeralds.
Those are the same emeralds.
And those of you who saw the Netflix series, The Last Doors, I think there's a scene in which these emeralds are smuggled just before the execution, and they try to stitch them into their clothes and go away.
Exactly, and sometimes they even swallowed them, because that was the only way to avoid detection by the Bolsheviks on the way out. After Grand Duchess Vladimir, we've got the Duchess of Manchester wearing that big tiara I showed you earlier on. We've got the English aristocracy and the American dollar princesses who are kind of shipped over from America to prop up the English aristocracy. Then we've got the Maharaja of Patiala in the middle there. The Indians were so important in the 1930s during the Great Depression in the West. And many luxury firms went under, but because Cartier had these great big commissions from the Maharajas, it really kept them going. Next to him, we've just got Gloria Swanson. I just thought it was fun to show her because she was one of the first kind of Hollywood stars. And so Cartier then switching their focus, instead of dressing just kings and queens and aristocrats, are now catering to actresses. And what's interesting there is that movies were in black and white, so rubies and emeralds didn't show up on screen. So they had to dress in diamonds and rock crystal. She's wearing her famous diamond and rock crystal bracelets there.
So did they actually have real diamond pieces for those?
They really did have diamond pieces. And after that, a lot of copycat firms did kind of imitation diamonds.
So something like that, you have a silent movie being made and a priceless piece of jewelry as a part of the movie.
Yeah,
oh, amazing.
Exactly, and it's a perfect advertisement, you know, whereas previously a queen wearing a tiara was a perfect advertisement. Now you've got another brilliant brand ambassador. And then we've got Marjorie Merriweather Post on the left, who was a big American Cartier client, and Barbara Hutton, as I said. But yeah, it's just that following wealth around the world were the men. And they were buying not for their women, but for themselves. And they didn't want the type of jewels that he was selling in Paris, so had to kind of rethink all that. But when he was there, he also went around buying gemstones, and he would bring those coloured gemstones back to the West. And he wrote in his diaries about how the light and the colours in India were so extraordinary. And that's what he really wanted to convey in the gems he then made for his Western clients. So India was this brilliant kind of relationship where many of the Maharajas were going to Cartier because they wanted the top of Parisian style, and the Western clients, Europeans and Americans, were going to Cartier because they wanted this brilliant Indian influence. So yeah, it worked very well for them.
And there's a lovely bit where you talk about how the Indian royals were the last word in glamour.
Exactly. To have an Indian royal at your party in Europe was
People
the
fought
ultimate.
over each other to have an Indian royal to be able to host a party for them.